Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to our Digital Preservation Connections lecture for Information Studies 753, Preserving Information Media. So here are our weekly topics for this week. How does digital preservation connect with other archival activities? Which archival activities? We'll touch on quite a few of them throughout this lecture. We'll focus quite a bit on appraisal, but also touch on a lot of the other topics that you learned about in your Intro to Archives course, and perhaps in more detail in other archives courses that you've taken during your MLAS or CAS, as it were. And also, how can these processes impact future digital preservation efforts? So what influence do things like appraisal, arrangement and description, outreach, and so on have on an archive's future digital preservation? So kind of looking into the future a little bit and seeing how what we can do now can really help in the future. Okay, so we'll start with perhaps one of the most important aspects of archiving and a very important topic when it comes to digital preservation, which is appraisal. So how do archives go about selecting a particular set of records from the masses and masses of digital records out there for future preservation? And the Ravenwood article does a good job of discussing how different groups of people or different influences might impact the selection choices that archivists make. So I have some of those in the diagram here. I couldn't fit all of them because for some reason there's a cap on how many things you can have in a PowerPoint smart object, but whatever. So I didn't include other institutions, but that's one as well, a fairly minor one. So I have the size of the circle in rough correspondence with the influence that the particular group within the circle will have on selection choices that an archives makes. So for instance, external funders may have a pretty limited influence on the selection choices that archivists make when it comes to digital preservation and appraising digital records. So there might be a time where you say, okay, well, this maybe isn't the best collection for us, but we'd really like to make this this person happy. Hopefully they'll contribute to the archive in the future, so we'll agree to take this collection. Colleagues, again, might be a pretty minimal influence. Researchers maybe should be a little bit bigger than this one because they can have some role on the selection choices that archivists make. So maybe I would go back and make this one a little bit bigger. The archivists that are actually working at the archive will have some influence on the choices that are made, maybe not as much of an influence as we might like. But some of the bigger ones that I have here are the donors themselves, and that's because they can have a really strong influence on just the types of records that are available for appraisal by archivists, acquisition by archivists, and ultimately preservation by archivists. And they can also have a lot of role in impacting the quality of the record, which is something that the new article talks about. So let's talk about the quality of record a little bit. You want records that are significant, that document some significant context of a person's life, of an organization's activities. And as the new article mentions, that's a really good place to start. looking at context instead of content when you are appraising digital records, simply because there are so many of them out there that looking at the context first can provide a good way to kind of separate the wheat from the chaff a little bit. Another factor might be the uniqueness or the diversity of the records. So if the records are from a community that has maybe been underrepresented in archives or in the archive that you're working at, that may be something that you consider when appraising the value of a set of records that your archive is offered. So just something else to keep in mind. Another good consideration, important consideration, is the authenticity of the record. So are the records reasonably similar now to how they were when the record was originally created? Do you have proof that the records were created and used by the donor, so that there wasn't some mixing of records coming in? Maybe there might be evidence that some of the records were actually created by, I don't know, the donor's brother-in-law or something else. So that might be something that you would be concerned about, because if that's the case, then it wouldn't be so-and-so's papers that you were looking at or so-and-so's records. It would be someone else's records. And so that can have some authenticity concerns. Just the overall accessibility of the records. That's something that the donors can have a lot of impact on. Donors may be creating records in a way or in a format that is difficult for archives to provide access to. And that's just going to require more work for archives to provide access to those records, especially in authentic or more authentic state. And then also looking at the metadata and the quality of the metadata and the interoperability of the metadata, which is something that the new article mentioned. So is the metadata something that is detailed, is metadata that really provides a lot of information about the context of the records, or is the metadata maybe a little light and you lose some of the, you don't have some of the information about the who, what, where, when, and why of the metadata? And also, can you take the metadata and apply it to a standard that an archive might use? So can you take the metadata that's already present in a record and sort of transition that metadata into whatever metadata standard your archive is using, like Premise or METS, MODS, Dublin Core, so on. Another thing that archives might look at are the legal requirements surrounding a record. So are there going to be a lot of restrictions on the record? Are there some privacy or copyright concerns? And so that's something else that can determine the quality of the record. And a lot of these things can be addressed by working with donors. So if you work with donors earlier on, that can make it more easy for you to get more authentic records to work with. If you work with donors early on, then you can ideally get records that are in a format that is easier for your archives to use. You can make sure that they're generating and maintaining rich metadata for your records that is going to be easy for you to transfer into your archive's chosen metadata standard. You can work with donors to help make some of the legal questions surrounding records a little less difficult to navigate. So maybe they give up copyright, maybe they agree not to restrict the records, and so on. And so working with donors and the ability that the degree that you're able to do that can really improve the overall quality of the record and influence your overall decisions about whether to select the record or not. And that can be a fairly influential thing. Two of the biggest factors from reading the Ravenwood article and just from my experience and my thoughts are the influence of the overall management or the institution as a whole, which I have kind of lumped together here, and also IT. So it's management that is going to give you the mandate to collect certain records, and that's an important thing to have, because otherwise people may be less likely to donate to you. They may not donate to you at all unless you have this sort of institutional mandate from your managers to collect certain records. So this is especially important in things like an organization or a university and so on, where there may be record schedules that say these records go to the archive. If that didn't exist, then departments might just say, okay, well, we're not going to donate anything. We're just going to destroy all this. And, obviously you can't appraise what you destroy. So it's really important to have a mandate to collect records. And again, that's something that can be coming from a management and an institutional level. Generally speaking, also your institution and your management is going to be the groups that determine what resources you have to conduct digital preservation. And that can be a big factor on your selection choices. If you don't have a lot of resources because your management doesn't give them to you or your institution doesn't support you, then that can really impact the number of records that you can acquire. It can impact the type of records that you can acquire, and it can really have a strong role on, or a strong influence on, your selection choices. Another big one is IT, simply because oftentimes archivists depend on information technology staff to help them develop the technology infrastructure that is required to preserve records long term. So to store them, to provide access to them, and so on. And so if IT is unable or unwilling to provide this infrastructure to you, then that can really limit the number and types of records that your archives is able to bring into the archive. And so that's another big factor that influences these selection decisions. So relatedly, here are some of the questions, certainly not an exhaustive list, but some questions that your archives might ask when making appraisal decisions for electronic records or digital records. So do we have a mandate for this collection or for this set of records? Is there some kind of connection between these records and between the mission of our archives and the goals of our archives and what we exist to do? If you dig a little bit deeper, you could say, is the context of the record's creation significant to our mandate or mission? So even if you do have the mandate for a collection, you could look at particular parts of that collection and say, okay, is this something that a person or organization did that really has a strong connection to the mission of our archives and why our archives exist? And if the question is yes, then those are records that you should probably consider acquiring. Another question you might ask is, do we have a relationship with the donor or creator? If yes, then ideally that relationship is something that you can leverage into increasing the quality of records, which I touched on before. Related to quality are the records in an optimal format and how authentic are the records. Again, both these things can really be supported by having this relationship with the donors and or creator of the records. Also, is there evidence/documentation of the record's authenticity? So getting back to this idea of metadata and how that can increase the quality of records. Do we have the technical infrastructure for preservation? So again, do we have the IT resources in place, or can we get the IT resources in place to provide long-term preservation for these records? And then relatedly, do we have the technical infrastructure for access? So can we provide access to the records that we're seeking to acquire and preserve long-term? So yeah, just some of the questions that you might think of and you might ask as you are making appraisal decisions about archival records. And again, you can connect these to some of the selection factors that I talked about before. So this might be related to the institution and management factor that the Ravenwood article discusses. Context is something that the new article discusses as an important starting point for appraisal. The relationship with the donor and the creator that I talked about as being pretty important, and then more of a focus on IT and potential limitations that that come from that. Okay, so how can we connect the appraisal of digital records with some of the preservation aspects that we talked about before? Obviously, when you're appraising records, you want to think about which ones you can fairly easily provide access to, because as we talked about before, that's really the ultimate goal of preservation. And so when you're appraising records, you should think, you know, do we have the resources to provide access to these records? Can we provide access to an authentic representation of these records, or at least as authentic as we want to? Connection to documentation. Ideally, you have some kind of appraisal policy that your archives addresses and looks at. Storage, you might think of your storage resources when you're appraising a record. So the volume of electronic records in a collection might be, you know, beyond what you have the storage capabilities to store those records. So that might be something that you think about. Sustainability. Good appraisal can really help your archive sustainability because you're not trying to bite off more than you can chew. You're focusing on records that have good metadata, which can save you time. You're focusing on records that are in formats that are easy for you to work with. You're focusing on records that are going to be accessible and aren't just going to sit on a shelf somewhere. So thinking about digital preservation when you are appraising records can really increase your archive's efficiency, and that can result in you using your resources in a way that is more efficient and doesn't lead to you wasting resources to store records that you can't really provide access to because they're in formats that you can't work with, or you're storing records that don't have a lot of metadata attached to them, and so there isn't really a whole lot of information about what the records actually are or what they meant to do. Collaboration, again, good appraisal has collaboration with the donor or creator of the record. Collaboration involves working with IT people to make sure that the records can be preserved and accessed over time. So, you know, it's important to take this collaboration into mind. Okay. So next we will talk about documentation and description, which was the focus of the theory and craft chapter for this week. And a lot of that chapter is focused on connections between digital preservation and digital records and MPLP, which is something that we talked about in this class uh, earlier on in the semester. And generally speaking, good metadata can serve as the description for a record. And it's possible for archives to allow the metadata to serve as the descriptive information attached to records. And it's possible that archivists don't really need to do much more beyond that. So there is an example in the ONS chapter, the 4chan archive, where they just kind of provide access to these records and they're just like, have at it. So really minimal intervention, again, just kind of relying on the information that the records have attached to them to allow researchers to discover and work with those records. That may not, rich metadata may not necessarily exist or be attached to every record that an archive has offered to it, of course. So it really is important for archives to, again, try and seek out records that do have rich metadata. And it's a good idea for archives to keep the richness of this metadata in mind when they are appraising records. So a record may have metadata attached to it when it's created, but that metadata may not necessarily remain attached to the record over time. And so that's just something that archives should be aware of. So again, this metadata can be a really great tool for archives to focus on big picture description and leverage the use of metadata to provide more granular detail. So the great thing about metadata, as I kind of touched on before, is that it can provide a lot of contextual knowledge about the content of the record. So in the Owens chapter, he talks about a tweet and how a tweet is really a very small amount of the actual information contained in the tweet itself. So I think you mentioned it's like 3% of the content of a tweet. So the rest of it is a lot of contextual information about, you know, when the tweet was tweeted, who tweeted it, some information about them, the number of likes and retweets that the tweet has, and other information that can really provide a lot of contextual information that researchers value. So what archives can do is they can attempt to just focus on and describe the content, or they can attempt to focus on the content and the context. So they can either say, you know, this is what the content is, and leave it to researchers to look at the metadata and discover the context of the record on their own, or archives can really make it evident to researchers what the content and the context is. And that choice is going to really depend on the archive and the importance of the records, the richness of the metadata and contextual information, the resources that the archive has to describe records. There are a few different factors that can go into this discussion. But again, it goes back to this idea of MPLP, and that you might choose for some records or for some collections to just make clear what the content is, and uh, and not really talk about the context of the records too much. For other records, you may focus on describing the content and the context, and really providing those details to researchers up front and making this information more accessible to researchers. So again, it just boils down to decisions that archives make about what information they want to preserve and what information they want to provide ready access to. So related to some of the talks about permanence that we discussed before, if you choose to just focus on the content, then researchers may not be aware of this contextual information, and it may kind of get lost in the shuffle. If you try and provide a description of the whole picture, then that's going to provide more information to researchers and may make the records more valuable and useful for researchers. Another interesting thing that the Owens article touched on is there may be records that are duplicates of each other or close copies of each other. So the author talked about what happens when they take a picture on their phone, and how it's automatically backed up to Twitter, and then maybe they post it on Facebook and they add a filter to something that they put on Instagram, and there can be a proliferation of different copies or near copies of one record that can exist in a variety of different formats in a variety of different places. And so again, archives can choose to attempt to describe all the instances of one photo or one image, or they may just say, we're only going to focus on describing this one instance and maybe the context of this one instance, and we don't really have the time or the inclination to focus on all of the perhaps slightly different versions of this image that exist in other places. Again, it just kind of depends on the resources that the archive has to bear. Another interesting thing that the Owens article talked about was how, if archives are able to detail the connections between the different contexts of records and how that can create a really rich web. So if you see the context of different records kind of pointing in the same direction and maybe illustrating the same event, like the Ferguson protests, which the Owens chapter mentions, then that can really enhance the understanding of that event that researchers might have. And Owens talks about how that's kind of the future of describing electronic records, is seeing where these different contexts that are documented in metadata kind of overlap, and the mass of information that overlap can provide to society and to researchers. So I thought that was a really interesting thing to consider. But I guess that's kind of an aside. So yeah, again, it just goes back to archives making choices about what resources they have to put into description, and those resources can really be impacted by the amount of contextual information and the form of metadata that archives have to choose from and work with in the first place. And if records have a lot of metadata, then it might be easier to provide more in-depth description, because you have a lot of the work done for you already. if records don't have a lot of metadata for whatever reason, maybe they're older records, or the metadata kind of got disassociated from the record at some point, then description can be more difficult and you're more limited in what you can do with that particular record. So some questions that archivists might consider when arranging and describing electronic records: what documentation for the records exists? Does the documentation describe actions to the record, such as migrations or digitization information? So are there some hints about the record's authenticity that you can see in the record's metadata? And that would be something that you would be interested in from a preservation point, and something that you would want to communicate to researchers. How much information about records, that should say, do researchers really need? So are we kind of going overboard if we're providing both the context and the content? Do researchers just need the content and they can kind of take it from there? Or what do our researchers need to have access to? Which copy of the record should we focus on describing, which I just mentioned? What contextual information is useful for our researchers? What contextual information do we have the resources to provide? And how are we deciding which information to provide access to in the future? So this last one is a pretty interesting and important one that the Owens article talks about. So the author discusses some of the negative repercussions which can result from archives essentially sharing certain information with the public. So the chapter talked about someone who was involved in the Ferguson protests, and the information that was contained in a tweet was used to prosecute that individual, and that individual ended up taking their life. The Owens article or chapter talked about potentially, showing a picture of someone's phone or someone's phone number and opening them up to harassment because of that. So it's important for archives to think about what they are preserving and what they're providing access to from an ethical standpoint as well. And there are a few different interesting articles out there about this. The Alyssa Hamer article that I talk about in my Intro to Archives class, if you remember that one, that's a really interesting article that really discusses the overlap between digital preservation and ethics, which is a pretty important field for archives to consider. And so you could really think of this as an ethical consideration. Okay, so some connections that we can make here to our aspects of digital preservation. So obviously, description improves the level of access to records that researchers have, simply because it gives them the ability to search through that information using a variety of different metadata fields. So that can just make the records overall more accessible and more easy for them to interact with. Authenticity, so I made the connection between metadata and authenticity. So there may be some clue in the metadata of records if there have been changes to the record's format or other things which might impact the record's authenticity. Documentation, you can think of metadata as a form of documentation. Maybe not a ton of overlaps between describing digital records and storage. Sustainability, if you are able to get rich metadata associated with a record, that can allow you to arrange and describe records more efficiently, which can result in a more efficient use of the resources that your archive has. And also you need to think of sustainability when you are deciding, do we focus on describing both the content and the context? Do we focus on describing all of the different iterations of this same photograph. And what does that look like? Collaboration, you could look at some ways that other archives are handling describing digital records. So that might be an area of collaboration. You might look at what standards are out there and collaborate. But that way, you can certainly collaborate, again, with donors to make sure that rich metadata is attached to records. And again, that can really improve the overall quality and usefulness of your digital preservation efforts and your descriptive efforts as well. Okay, so those were the two big ones that I'll focus on for this lecture. There are a few more that are a little, well, no, actually outreach is a big one too. So we've talked about outreach off and on throughout this class, and it really is an important thing for archives to consider when it comes to digital preservation as well. And there really are a lot of important overlaps between digital preservation and outreach activities that archives engage in. So it's important to think of how outreach as a requirement for digital preservation, and in a lot of ways how digital preservation can be used as an outreach tool. So it's kind of like a symbiotic relationship. So digital preservation requires a lot of resources, which we've talked about. It requires staff. It may require staff that have a specialized background, which can be more expensive than someone that maybe doesn't have those skills. It requires technical infrastructure, just to name a few of the different resources that digital preservation requires. And if an archive doesn't engage in outreach, then they may not have access to the resources that they need in order to adequately preserve electronic records. So it's important that archives are constantly promoting themselves and really working to make people perceive archives as being important and valuable parts of an institution, whether that be a corporation or a university, and so on. So outreach is really important for digital preservation. An archive shouldn't overlook how digital preservation can be used as an outreach tool. So if archives talk about how important digital preservation is, if they talk about some of the challenges that digital preservation involves, and how they were able to overcome those challenges, or even how they aren't able to overcome those challenges because they don't have the resources that they need, then that can be something that can really lead to people supporting the archive. So if you say, last year we managed to acquire and continue to preserve 3 terabytes of information through our digital preservation efforts. That's something that you can say, this is what digital preservation is, this is how we're exceeding it, digital preservation, this is why we should be valued and trusted as an archival organization. Things like the digital preservation policies and plans, which we discussed last week. You can say, okay, look at this. This maps exactly what we're doing. It maps the thought process that we went through. It maps the standards and different goals that we're trying to meet. And this really shows that we're being really careful and deliberate about our digital preservation efforts. And it really shows that our digital preservation efforts are are worthy of support. So again, this symbiotic relationship where outreach is important for digital preservation, and digital preservation can be used as a form of outreach. Another thing that I'll mention, which I touched on before, is you don't want to forget about outreach to potential donors and making sure that they're aware of what digital preservation is and how they can develop their records in a way which makes digital preservation easier down the road. So that's just another example of how outreach can support digital preservation. So some outreach questions that you might consider when thinking about digital preservation: who can provide the resources archives need for digital preservation? Who out there kind of controls the strings? Who out there is going to be involved in determining which resources we have to carry out our digital preservation activities? And then once you have established that, you can ask yourself, how can we effectively communicate the values of archives and/or digital preservation to these individuals? How can we demonstrate to them that what we're doing is important, that digital preservation matters, and hopefully demonstrating this importance can lead to increased support for digital preservation now and in the future as well. And so related to that, how well is an archives communicating the challenges and goals of digital preservation? How well are we doing at letting people know what it is we're doing and why we're doing it? And again, hopefully doing this in an effective way is going to lead to more resources for the archives to devote to digital preservation in the future. If people don't know what digital preservation is, if they don't know why they should value digital preservation, if they don't know why it matters, what an archive is doing for digital preservation, then they're very unlikely to support it. And so it's up to archives to really fill in the blanks about what the importance and challenges of digital preservation are, and convince resource allocators and donors and so on to support digital preservation efforts. Generally speaking, digital preservation is kind of an easy sell because it's something that a lot of people are going to understand, but they may not understand all the challenges and nuances associated with it and how they can contribute to archives successfully preserving digital records. Okay, so some connections to some of the different aspects of digital preservation with outreach. Obviously, outreach can lead to greater resources to provide access to records, you know, whether that be staff members, and so on. Reaching out to donors, again, can result in archives receiving records that are more authentic and maybe more useful for researchers. Documentation can serve as an important form of outreach. So again, our digital preservation policies and plans are good examples of that. Outreach can lead to more storage for archives. Overall, outreach is very influential on the sustainability of an archives as a whole and on an archives digital preservation, digital preservation efforts. So again, if people don't know what digital preservation is or why it's important, or if they don't trust your archives to carry it out properly, then you're going to have a difficult time getting the resources that you need to keep your digital preservation program going. Collaboration is an important one. If you are collaborating with other people, then that's something that you can also highlight in your outreach. You can, meet with your director and say, we're working on this problem. We're collaborating with this other group or this other archives to help solve it, and that really shows that you are that you're being a good steward of the resources that you do have, and ideally that's going to lead to people being more willing to support your archives in the future, because they do see that you're making an effort to be efficient and responsible with what you have, and therefore it may be more likely for them to give you additional resources to work with in the future. They know you're not just throwing away money trying to recreate every single form and every single process that you have, but rather you're working with other organizations and other archives to see how you can do things in an efficient manner. And that's something that resource allocators and donors really like to see. Okay, so we'll also touch on records management. This is something that the Anderson article touched on with the capstone project at the National Archives. So records are created, they're used, a determined length of time passes, and then those records may go into archival custody. And so oftentimes this is going to be dictated by a record schedule. And which records actually fit into a record schedule and the length of time that they're kept before they end up in archival custody is really going to depend on that record schedule. So as we've talked about before, if records are in kind of limbo for a long time before they come into archival custody, this can make digital preservation more difficult, because the hardware that a set of electronic records is on might deteriorate. That might cause the records to become corrupted and less authentic. The records just may be more difficult to access as hardware and other things become more obsolete. Like maybe records are on floppy disks, and 20 years later it's just more difficult to find a way to access floppy disks. So generally speaking, the longer this length of time is, the more difficult it can be to preserve records when they come into archival custody. But this length of time may well be fixed into a record schedule, and there may not be a lot that an archives can necessarily do with that. And then there's this question about what gets put into different record schedules. So with the capstone project, if you'll recall, there was a lot of concern that it only covered a few different individuals in the CIA, and people are like, well, there's probably more important records in the CIA than ones that are kept by just these few people. So that can have obvious preservation issues as well. If something is not kept into a record schedule, or it's not marked for long-term retention, then that can result in the records being destroyed or inaccessible for whatever reason, which obviously results in a loss of information. So these record schedules really can have a lot of influence on which records are available for preservation and how easy it is for archivists to preserve records once they come in to archival custody. So there might be some questions that archives might ask that relate to records management. So, which records must the archives take according to record schedules? So there might be records that are scheduled to come into the archive that the archive doesn't necessarily want. They might say, okay, well, we don't really want to take these, but for whatever reason, we're expected to. And, these are just records that we have to preserve, and we can't really do anything about it because that's what the record schedule says. That's what we have to kind of follow and adhere to. Another question might be, how can archives influence the format those records are in? So is it, again, possible for archives to work with records creators before the records come in to archival custody to help make those records be more easily preserved when they do wind up on the archive's doorstep. Relatedly, how can archives influence the metadata associated with these records? Can we work with records creators to make sure that there's rich metadata attached to these records so that, again, it's easier for us to preserve and describe and provide access to them in the future? What kind of access will these records require? Are we expected to provide access to them in their most authentic form? Are we allowed to migrate the records or take other steps to preserve them that might impact the authenticity of records? And relatedly, how much freedom does the archives have to modify the records? So getting back to this idea of authenticity and permanence. So the degree to which archives can influence things like the format the records come in and influence the metadata associated with these records before they come into the repository is really going to depend on how the archive is viewed. So it kind of goes back to this idea of outreach. Maybe if the archives has done a lot of outreach and people have an appreciation and an understanding of what the archives does, then maybe they even have some role in determining what record schedules look like in the first place. So just to provide a little bit of a connection between records management and outreach. But hopefully you're able to see some of the connections between records management and digital preservation. And again, to help us do that, we'll look at some of our aspects of digital preservation. So access, records may be more or less accessible depending on the amount of time between when the record is used and created and when the records come into the archive. Same with authenticity. If this is a long period of time between when the records are created and when they're transferred to the archives, then that can have some authenticity difficulties, which I touched on in the last slide. Documentation, obviously, a record schedule is a form of documentation that archives have to follow. Storage, so you could ask what kind of storage conditions are records being kept in before they arrive in archives. That may not necessarily be something that is indicated in a record schedule, but it can be, as we talked about before, an important factor in the overall authenticity and accessibility of records when they come into a repository. Sustainability, generally speaking, if archives can intervene and work with records creators before the records come into the repository, no matter what the records retention schedule says, the more efficient they're going to be able to use their resources, and that can promote sustainability, as we've talked about before. In collaboration, again, there may be an opportunity for archives to collaborate with records managers to influence what record schedules look like or how they're implemented. There may be the ability for archivists to collaborate with records creators and donors before the records actually end up in archives. Again, just to improve the overall accessibility and authenticity of the records. Okay, so we'll just briefly touch on a few different connections here. So I talked a little bit about some of the ethical considerations. Archivists need to be aware of what information they're preserving, what information they are describing and making more accessible for people, and how that information might be used in the future. So people may not be aware or be less aware of metadata that is associated with the digital records that they create or the digital records that they may be represented in. They may not be able to control that information and where that information is going. And that can, as the Owens chapter mentioned, it can, potentially put people and harm. It can provide them with some kind of legal risk, and that's certainly not something that archives want to facilitate happening. Social justice. So archives should be mindful about the need to be proactive about working with challenged communities to make sure that their records are preserved and that their records are present in archives. This might not be something that is just going to naturally occur, and so it may be necessary for the archives to be proactive about developing that relationship and letting people in challenged communities know that their perspective is important and that their perspective in history should be preserved. And, you know, that's certainly an important part of preservation as a whole, and obviously digital preservation as well. Community archives, this is something that the ONUS chapter talked a little bit about, but it may be that people represented in records are the best ones at determining how the record should be preserved, the different types of metadata and information that should be attached to those records. And you know, this really corresponds with the community archives idea of community participation in what the information that's preserved and how that information is represented. And finally, personal archives. There can be a real benefit for archives working with the public or potential donors to educate them about how to maintain their records, how to preserve their records, and hopefully that results in it not being the case where records are being destroyed or become inaccessible due to benign neglect by the general public. And if you'll recall from Intro to Archives, there was an article by Becker and Noakes, which really discussed this, this idea of benign neglect and this connection between digital preservation and personal archives. And again, it just goes back generally to the importance of archivists working with people creating electronic records so that the overall quality of the records is higher, so that you know, the records remain as authentic as possible, that the records remain attached to metadata associated with the record, and other things that can just make it easier and more efficient for archives to preserve and provide access to records now and into the indefinite future. So that's really an aspect of digital preservation that corresponds with pretty much everything that we've talked about in this lecture. So hopefully, you know, you're aware of the importance of that, and it's something that you really think about when you're preserving digital records in the future. Okay, so I won't connect all of those to these different aspects of digital preservation. I kind of did as I went through them, so I'll go ahead and just skip that part. And you know, we'll come back and explore off and on the connections between all of these aspects of archiving that we've talked about today with digital preservation as we move through the semester. Okay, so that's it for our connections to different archival processes. So it really is interesting to, or important to understand that nothing that an archives does exists in a vacuum, and that there are connections between really everything that an archives does. So between appraisal and digital preservation, between digital preservation and outreach, between digital preservation and arrangement and description, and some of the other topics that we talked about. And in order to do one thing well, archives really need to think about how what they're doing can impact sort of multiple processes in an archive. So if you do appraisal well, it can help your digital preservation efforts in the future. If you do outreach well, it can really help you with your digital preservation. So it's just important to be proactive and kind of think about that and keep that in mind as you're making decisions about what your appraisal is going to look like, what your outreach is going to look like, what your records management responsibilities are, and how you can influence those, and some of the other topics that we talked about today. So as always, let me know if you have any questions, and have a great week and stay safe.